Here's a number that doesn't sound real at first. 640 million acres. That's how much land the federal government of the United States currently owns and manages inside this country's own borders. 640 million acres. If you're trying to picture that, here's one way to think about it. That's more than 2.5 million square kilometers of land owned by your government. It is land you can hike on, camp on, drive through, graze cattle on, drill beneath, mine inside of, and in some cases, never enter without a permit. And here's the part that makes even longtime students of American history do a double take. That figure represents roughly 28% of all land in the United States. Nearly 1 in 3 acres of this country belongs to the federal government, not to states, not to private citizens, to the federal government. And yet, most Americans have never really thought about this, never been taught to think about it, and wouldn't guess it in a million years. So today, we are going to dig into one of the most fascinating, most consequential, and most underexplored stories about the land beneath your feet, where it came from, who controls it, why the map looks the way it does, and what it all means for the country we live in today. I want to be upfront about something before we start. The numbers in this video come directly from the Congressional Research Service, the U.S. Government Accountability Office, the Bureau of Land Management, and the National Archives, the most reliable primary sources available. I'm not embellishing anything here, and honestly, I don't need to. The actual numbers are wild enough. Let's start with the basics. The total land area of the United States is approximately 2.27 billion acres. That's the whole country, from sea to shining sea. Of that, the federal government manages roughly 640 million acres, according to the Congressional Research Service. That's about 28%, more than a quarter, less than a third, depending on how you count it. The U.S. Government Accountability Office confirms this figure.
These aren't estimates from advocacy groups. This is the government's own accounting of itself. Now, 28% sounds like a lot. But here's where the story gets genuinely strange. That number is an average, and as any statistician will tell you, averages can hide everything interesting, because the moment you zoom in, the moment you look at this state by state, you discover that the federal government's footprint across America is not evenly distributed at all. It is radically, almost incomprehensibly concentrated. And the dividing line between where the government does and doesn't own huge swaths of land runs roughly down the middle of the country, with almost all of it piling up in the West. According to data from the Congressional Research Service, the federal government owns roughly 46% of all land across the 11 contiguous western states, nearly half of the West. In the rest of the country, the other 38 states, the federal government owns about 4%. 4%. Think about that contrast for a second. If you live in Ohio, Indiana, Georgia, or New York, you're in a state where federal land is almost invisible, mostly military bases, a few national parks, scattered parcels. But if you live in Idaho, Utah, Wyoming, Oregon, or Montana, you are surrounded by it. The federal government is, in a very real sense, your neighbor, often your biggest neighbor by far. Now let me take you to the most extreme example of this, because it genuinely has to be heard to be believed. Nevada, the Silver State, home to Las Vegas, the gambling capital of the world, the neon lights, the most visited city in America. And yet, according to the Congressional Research Service, more than 80% of Nevada's total land area is federally owned. More than 80%. The Las Vegas metropolitan area, Reno, a handful of other cities, all of that enormous human activity, all of those casinos, airports, suburbs, exists on less than 20% of the state's land. Everything else belongs to Washington. To the Bureau of Land Management, the Fish and Wildlife Service, the Forest Service, the Department of Defense, the state of Nevada is one of the largest states in the lower 48, and most of it is technically not Nevada's to decide. To put it another way, if you drive out of Las Vegas on almost any highway and keep going past the suburbs and the sprawl, you will cross an invisible line at some point. And from that moment on, the land you're looking at, those mountains, those valleys, those salt flats stretching to the horizon, belongs to the federal government. It's been that way for over 150 years. And the story of why is one of the most revealing episodes in American history. When Nevada was admitted to the Union in 1864 during the Civil War, famously rushed into statehood just days before the presidential election to add electoral votes for Abraham Lincoln, the state was required as a condition of admission to disclaim all interest in federal public lands within its borders. That clause is still in Nevada's state constitution today. The state was literally born having signed away most of itself. And then, when the federal government tried to give that land away through programs like the Homestead Act, few people wanted it. Because most of Nevada is desert, arid, rocky, hard land. The homesteaders went to Kansas, to Nebraska, to the fertile plains. Nevada's land sat, unclaimed, and it became federal by default. And then there's Alaska. If Nevada is the most dramatic example in the lower 48, Alaska is something else entirely. According to federal land records and the Bureau of Land Management, the federal government owns approximately 60% of Alaska's total land area, roughly 222 million acres. Let me put that in perspective. The federal government owns more land in Alaska alone than the entire land area of Texas. Texas, the largest state in the lower 48, covers about 170 million acres. Alaska's federal land exceeds that by 50 million acres. When Alaska became the 49th state in 1959, nearly its entire territory was under federal ownership. The Alaska Statehood Act transferred over 100 million acres to the state. The Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act of 1971 transferred tens of millions of acres to native corporations and villages, and still the federal government retains about 60%. The BLM, the Fish and Wildlife Service, the National Park Service, they collectively manage a piece of the earth so vast it is difficult to fully comprehend. Alaska's designated wilderness areas alone make up approximately 54% of all designated wilderness acreage in the entire nation. Now contrast all of this with the other end of the spectrum, Connecticut and Iowa. According to the same Congressional Research Service data, the federal government owns just 0.3% of land in each of those states. In Connecticut, we're talking about roughly 9,000 acres. In a state that's smaller than many ranches in Montana. Rhode Island has even fewer total federal acres. These eastern states are almost entirely privately owned or state-managed. When people in New England think about public land, they're often thinking about state parks and local conservation areas. Federal land, in their daily experience, barely exists. So how did this happen? How did the country end up with this extraordinary east-west divide? To answer that, you have to go back to the very beginning. When the original 13 colonies became the United States, the new nation inherited and gradually acquired through treaties, purchases, and wars, an almost incomprehensibly large piece of the North American continent. The Louisiana Purchase of 1803 doubled the country's land area overnight. The settlement of the Oregon Territory, the Mexican-American War, the Gadsden Purchase. By the mid-19th century, the United States had accumulated vast western territories that dwarfed the settled East. The federal government owned it all by default because nobody else did. The question from that point forward was simple. What do you do with all this land? And for most of the 19th century, the answer was equally simple. You give it away, distribute it, get people onto it. Build the nation. That philosophy produced one of the most ambitious pieces of legislation in American history, the Homestead Act of 1862, signed by President Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War. The National Archives puts it plainly, the act granted any adult citizen
or any immigrant intending to become a citizen the right to claim 160 acres of surveyed public land, free of charge, with a small filing fee and 5 years of continuous residence. You show up, you build a house, you work the land, you stay for 5 years, and then it's yours. According to Britannica, in total, some 270 million acres were distributed under the Homestead Act, approximately 10% of the entire United States. The last claim under the act was granted in 1988 for a parcel of land in Alaska. According to the Department of Housing and Urban Development, roughly 93 million Americans today are descendants of people who received land through the Homestead Acts. The program shaped the demographic and physical geography of this country in ways we still live inside of. But, and here's the thing they almost never teach in school, the Homestead Act didn't work everywhere. It worked remarkably well in the Great Plains, where the land was flat, the soil was rich, and rainfall was sufficient. Iowa, Nebraska, Kansas, the Dakotas, that was the sweet spot. But in the arid West, the desert Southwest, the mountains of Nevada and Utah and Idaho, 160 acres was often not enough to sustain a family. The land was too dry, too rocky, too remote. The National Archives notes that much of the land that went unclaimed in the West simply ended up staying in federal ownership, despite every effort to give it away. The federal government tried and tried to dispose of these lands, and the land said no. When you read that history, you understand why the map looks the way it does today. The East was privatized, the arid West mostly wasn't. At the same time that land was being given away, something else was beginning to happen, something genuinely radical for its time. Americans started to look at certain pieces of their country and say, we cannot sell this. Some places are too extraordinary to be parceled, developed, and consumed. The single most important moment in that story came on March 1, 1872. President Ulysses S. Grant signed the act establishing Yellowstone National Park, withdrawing over 2 million acres of land in the territories of Wyoming and Montana from settlement, occupancy, or sale forever. The language of the act is still extraordinary to read. The land was dedicated and set apart as a public park or pleasuring ground for the benefit and enjoyment of the people. Not for profit, not for extraction, for the people, for everyone. The National Archives calls it the first federally protected national park by act of Congress, and as the historians at the Library of Congress note, it set a precedent that spread to other nations around the world. The concept of the national park is an American invention. We gave that idea to the world, and it is one of the most enduring things we've ever given. That Yellowstone legislation launched a system that, according to the National Park Service, now encompasses 419 units across more than 80 million acres. National parks, national monuments, national seashores, national recreation areas, battlefields, historic sites, a network of preserved places that spans the continent and draws hundreds of millions of visits each year. And crucially, this was a deliberate philosophical choice by Congress. Some land should be taken permanently off the table, not sold, not homesteaded, held in common, forever, for everyone. By the early 20th century, the federal government's role as a land manager was expanding in new directions. The Forest Service was created in 1905, charged with managing the national forests, not for preservation exactly, but for what they called multiple use and sustained yield, timber harvesting, grazing, water protection, recreation. The idea was that these forests could be used without being destroyed if managed carefully. Today, the Forest Service manages approximately 193 million acres, according to the Congressional Research Service, an area roughly the size of Turkey. Those are your national forests, your hiking trails, your logging operations, your ski resorts, all on federal land. Then there's the Bureau of Land Management, which manages the largest single block of federal land.
approximately 244 million acres, according to Congressional Research Service data. The BLM was created in 1946 and given a mandate often described as multiple use, meaning these lands can be grazed, mined, drilled, recreated on, and conserved all at the same time, sometimes an uneasy combination. When you hear about federal grazing rights in Nevada, about oil and gas leases in Wyoming, about solar energy development in the California desert, that's almost always BLM land. It is some of the most contested real estate in America, politically and legally, and the debates around it have only intensified in recent decades. The Fish and Wildlife Service manages around 89 million acres, primarily as wildlife refuges, places set aside to protect migratory birds, endangered species, fish habitat, and ecosystems that have been pressed hard by development. And the Department of Defense, separate from all of the above, administers roughly 8.8 million acres within the United States, according to Congressional Research Service. Military bases, training ranges, testing grounds. The largest single DoD-owned land tract in the country is White Sands Missile Range in New Mexico, covering over 2 million acres. And here's the part that gets me every time I sit with this story. Between 1781 and 2018, according to the Wikipedia summary of federal land records, the federal government divested itself of approximately 1.29 billion acres. Almost 1.3 billion acres, given away, sold, transferred to states, granted to railroads, homesteaded by families, transferred to native communities. 1.3 billion acres. And yet, after all of that, the federal government still holds roughly 640 million acres. The magnitude of the original public domain, the raw, inherited landmass of this republic, was so enormous that even after nearly 2.5 centuries of deliberately trying to distribute it, the government still holds more land than any private entity on Earth. Now, none of this is without controversy, and the channel philosophy here is to be honest about complexity, not to paper over it. The debates about federal land ownership are real, deeply felt, and not simple. Western communities have argued for generations that federal ownership constrains their economies, limits local tax bases, since federal land generates no property taxes, and removes decision-making power from the people who actually live there. In states like Nevada, where more than 80% of the land is federally owned, local governments depend on federal payments in lieu of taxes to fund schools and services, and those payments have been volatile. The argument for returning some federal lands to states is not fringe politics. It's a serious policy debate that crosses party lines in the West. At the same time, advocates for retaining federal lands point to their role in protecting water supplies, supporting wildlife migration, providing recreation access to all Americans regardless of income, and preserving landscapes that, once privatized, would be lost forever. The national park idea specifically rests on the principle that some places belong to everyone, and that future generations deserve to inherit them intact. There is also the history with Native peoples that cannot be ignored. The vast public domain that the federal government assembled in the 19th century was assembled through the displacement of Indian nations who had lived on that land for thousands of years. The Homestead Act, as the National Archives itself notes, cannot be disentangled from federal Indian policy. The Great Land Transfer of the 1800s was not just a story of opportunity, it was also a story of dispossession, and understanding it honestly requires holding both of those truths at the same time. Some of the federal land that still exists today, the wildlife refuges, the wilderness areas, the national parks, sits on land that was the home, the hunting ground, the sacred territory of people who were pushed out. That context matters. Here's the part that genuinely blew my mind when I first pulled all these numbers together. The United States, this country built on the idea of private property, rugged individualism, land ownership as the foundation of citizenship and freedom,
This same country is, by any measure, one of the largest government landowners on the planet within its own borders. The federal government holds more land inside the United States than most entire countries contain in total. That is not a criticism, it's just a fact. It's a fact that reflects choices made over 2.5 centuries, choices that were sometimes visionary, sometimes contested, sometimes born of failure, and sometimes born of extraordinary foresight. When Ulysses Grant signed Yellowstone into a public park in 1872, the idea that the government should set aside land purely for public enjoyment was genuinely strange to most people. Many congressmen voted for it because they thought the land was worthless anyway. They were wrong. Yellowstone is visited by millions of people every year, has inspired similar parks in every corner of the world, and represents something about the American character that is harder to quantify, but just as real: the belief that some things should not be for sale. That tension between the drive to privatize, develop, and grow, and the instinct to preserve, protect, and hold in common runs through all 640 million acres of federal land. It runs through every congressional debate about drilling and conservation, every court battle between ranchers and environmental groups, every moment a family pitches a tent in a national forest and wakes up the next morning to silence and mountains. It is one of the defining, unresolved arguments of American life, and it has been going on since before there was a country. Most people, if you stopped them on the street and asked how much of America the federal government owns, would guess maybe 5%, maybe 10%. The real answer? Nearly 30%, and nearly half the entire West. Changes the way you see the map. It changes the way you understand Western politics, the Sagebrush Rebellion, the fights over grazing rights and water rights and mineral rights. It changes the way you understand the parks you've visited and the ones you've always meant to. And it makes the Homestead Act story feel different too, because you realize that the 270 million acres that were given away was not the end of the story. It was barely half of it. There is still, out there, land that belongs to all of us, mountains in Idaho that you have the legal right to hike, river canyons in Utah that no one can develop, wetlands in Alaska where birds you've never seen stop on journeys of thousands of miles. All of it held, imperfectly, in common. All of it part of the argument this country has been having with itself since the beginning. I think that argument is worth knowing about. I think the land is worth knowing about. And I hope this is the kind of thing that makes you want to look at a map differently the next time you fly over it. So here's my question for you in the comments. Did this number surprise you? Did you know that the federal government owned nearly 30% of the country? And if you live in one of those western states where the government owns more than half the land, Nevada, Utah, Idaho, how does that feel? Does it feel like a resource, like an intrusion? I'd genuinely love to know. If this story changed the way you think about the land you live on, share it. These are the kinds of facts that should be common knowledge, and the fact that they're not is exactly why this channel exists. Subscribe and hit the bell, and I'll see you in the next one.